Good evening, folks. Welcome along to the first ever Fools and Ferns. As most of you are aware, back in April, we were forced to postpone what would have been our fourth Fools and Ferns beer festival. We had an episode on this channel with most of the brewers a little while back, and you can watch the replay if you missed out. The craft beer community, and in particular, craft brewers have been amazing with their support of us during this time. And these episodes are an attempt to give something back to this awesome community. Just before I hand over to Trevor, who's going to introduce our guest speaker for today, I want to ask for some assistance in supporting our community heroes who have turned their brew houses into soup kitchens to feed the thousands of South Africans who are unable to put food on their tables during this time. I do appreciate times are tough, but if you do have anything to spare, I put a link in the comments below to Drifter, Stellies, and Woodstock Brewery's campaigns. And I do know that Woodstock are currently desperate to get funding for 1,000 litre flow bins in order to get soup out to the people. If you don't have anything to spare, then please share the links on your social media pages and try and get the word out. But over to Trevor to introduce our guest for today. Really excited for this one. There you go, Trevor.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And really, it's just such a huge privilege and honor to have Brad here with us. I've been stalking him on emails for about 3 years, and I must say, every time you send an email to Bradley, he always responds. So thank you for that. Such a humble character, a retired colonel in the Air Force, very involved in the space program, and started home brewing in 1987, I think, Bradley, if I'm correct. And everyone who's done home brewing will know the BeerSmith set of software, which is such a great asset and aid to home brewing, and most commercial brewers have used it as well. It's quite difficult to find more information about you, Bradley. You in spite of being so well known, there's not too much on the internet about who you actually are. You're based just outside of Washington. You do a lot of work with John Palmer, who's a friend of South Africa. And without much further ado, please, we'd love to hear your talk on designing beer, and there'll be time for some questions afterwards. So thank you very, very much.
Well, Trevor, thanks for having me. I really appreciate you inviting me to speak today. Been doing a lot of these. I was mentioning it to you earlier, have had quite a few clubs contacting me lately about doing presentations, and Palmer's been doing them as well. But it's great to, I haven't done too many overseas, so it's great to talk to a group in South Africa. Hope you're all doing well today. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about designing beer. And as you mentioned, I started brewing quite a long time ago. I actually started in 1987. And I think the only book available at the time was, the one from the AHA, basically, and that was it. What's interesting is, when I started brewing, things were a lot different. We didn't have a lot of the knowledge we have today on home brewing. And particularly, we didn't have a lot of knowledge on beer recipe design. And so it was much harder to develop recipes on our own. For example, when I started out, we basically had recipes that said, boil the hops and a couple ounces of hops. And there was no concept of bitterness units or really estimating your original gravity. You kind of took a wag at it. So it was a much different time than now. And one of the things we found out, one of the things that's interesting about all this is when I started out way back in 1987, without all this knowledge, there was not an opportunity really to discuss things. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have the chat rooms. We didn't have bulletin boards. We didn't have email at that time. So a lot of it was done in person. But what started to change is in the early 90s, we had the early internet pop up, and we had news groups, and we had bulletin boards, and we had the start of the World Wide Web. But one of the consequences of that is that the people who were involved in the early World Wide Web were primarily scientists and engineers. And so scientists and engineers really drove the discussion in early homebrewing. And keep in mind, the craft beer revolution was also happening about the same time in the early 90s. And so that drove the discussion in unusual ways in beer brewing, or in a different way in beer brewing than it did perhaps in something like winemaking or mead making, if you got any experience with those hobbies. So what happened is in the early 90s, people like John Palmer started writing his first book. Glenn Tinseth, who I've introduced, came up with the Tinseth equation for estimating bitterness for beer. A lot of the early work was done on hop varieties, and trying to quantify aroma oils was started in the 90s. So all this work was being done on the early internet. And one consequence of that is, and I'm going to bring up my slides real quick. One consequence of that is that home brewing and beer brewing in general took on a very technical nature to it. So let me just pop this up real quick here. So we have more of a deliberate or mechanical or scientific approach to beer brewing than we do to something like winemaking or mead making or cider making. And because a lot of people that drove the discussion then, I'm an engineer, John Palmer's an engineer, Blickman's an engineer. A lot of the people who were involved in that discussion, those discussions and that development, were engineers. They pushed beer brewing very much towards the technical end of things. And we're still sort of suffering some of the consequences of that today. And I'll give you an example. If I sit down and talk with John Palmer about making beer, a lot of times our discussion, devolves into, the technical details of water or something like that. But if I sit down with somebody like Randy Mosher, we're going to have a much different discussion. And the reason is Randy Mosher is a graphical artist. So Randy, when I sit down and talk about Randy about making beer, a lot of times the discussion will go something like this. It'll be like, Randy will go, I had some bananas laying around. They looked like they were going to go bad. So I fried them up and I made a beer out of it. And that's kind of the way Randy thinks. He thinks about the flavors and trying something really unique or different. Much different approach to, saying, I'm going to brew, a Belgian strong, and I'm going to make it exactly this gravity and this bitterness level and this sort of thing. The point of this whole story, though, is there's a balance between these two. Really, there's a balance between a highly technical approach to beer brewing, and certainly you have to get some things right when you're brewing beer. You got to have the process down correctly. Obviously, it's very sensitive to bacteria and those kinds of things. But at the same time, I think a lot of us get too focused on the technical end and really don't dive into the artistic end of things, which is very, very important when brewing beer, and particularly understanding the flavors that are going to go into your beer. So today I'm going to talk about recipe design, and I'm going to try and throw a little bit of both of these aspects into it. So I'm going to share some technical knowledge, but I'm also going to try and share some artistic or flavor knowledge, if you will, into things. And I'm going to talk about different approaches for designing beer really quickly up front. First, I'll talk about the traditional approach. I don't really have a slide for it, but sort of traditional approach really is more technically focused. You sit down and go, I want to brew brown ale or something like that, and you'll go to the BJCP style guide maybe, or some other style guide, and pull up the style and go, it's got to be in this gravity range, and it's got to be in this bitterness range, and it uses these general ingredients and these general kinds of yeast and so on. And I mean, that's a very valuable approach and very valid approach, but I would encourage you also to maybe consider some other approaches as well. I'm going to throw one up from Gordon Strong. This is from Gordon Strong's book. Gordon actually uses this concept called ingredient blocks. So rather than, starting with a blank sheet of paper, if he wants to design a new recipe, Gordon will actually take something he already has used before. So let's say he wants to brew that brown ale we were talking about a minute ago. He might sit down and go, I've done a porter, and the porter, I like the flavor profile that came out of this porter was really nice, and I'm going to just take that and tone it down and make my brown ale out of it. The concept here is to not reinvent the wheel every time, but to reuse something you already know. And this can be very powerful, especially if you get some combination of ingredients that works well together. And I'll talk about, for example, in a few minutes, how to get depth in your beer, maybe depth in something like a robust porter. But it's a very powerful concept. And like Steve Jobs, for example, there's a quote from Steve Jobs you can read at the bottom there. I'll move my thing up here. But he didn't just, he didn't necessarily invent the smartphone. He did it by taking two existing concepts, the PDA, if you will, and the phone, and kind of smashing them together into one device. And this is how a lot of powerful new concepts are put together, really, by taking two ideas that might be unrelated and putting them together. Here's another example of the same sort of concept, but focused more on flavors. And the point of this is, I sat down one day and I was making pancakes, and I pulled out a box of Bisquick. And obviously you can make pancakes with Bisquick, but turns out if you just vary the ingredients just slightly, you can make all kinds of other things. You can make waffles, you can make biscuits, you can make dumplings, you make shortcakes, right? And they all use the same basic ingredients. They use, flour or the Bisquick mix in this case, which is usually flour with just a few things added to it. But, they use eggs, they use butter, they use a little bit of oil maybe, or, sugar, salt, all those things. The point is, you're able to build a lot of these same things from the same ingredients because you understand the underlying flavors, right? When I say butter, you've all stuck your finger in the butter at some point and put it in your mouth, and you know exactly what butter tastes like. You know what salt tastes like. You know what all these basic ingredients. You know what flour tastes like. You know what all these things taste like, and also you know how the flavors fit together to a large degree. The problem being that, of course, with beer, when it comes to beer making, very few people have actually sat down and tasted, individual malts, or maybe brewed a beer with individual malts, or tasted and really, put some time in with individual hops to get an idea of the aroma and the flavor that goes with those hops. So I'm going to talk about those flavors and aromas and talk about ways to get to those as we walk through the slides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of walk through each ingredient group. We'll do the 4 basic ingredients. We'll talk a little bit about grains. We'll talk a little bit about hops. We'll talk about water and so on. And I'm going to walk through first a couple techniques or ideas that go around designing beer based on that ingredient. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about flavors. So we'll dive a little bit into flavors as well. So the first thing I want to say is we'll start with grain tips, and I got a few key points here. So one of them is one of the first key points when you're developing new recipes is simply simplicity. If you go to a professional brew house, typically they don't have 50 types of grains laying around like you do at your local homebrew shop, right? They've only got maybe 5 or 6 types of grain laying around, usually in 50-pound bags, and they're going to use those same 5 or 6 grains to make their entire arrangement of recipes, right? And they do that by reinforcing the concept of simplicity. Basically, you use a base malt for the vast majority of your grain bill, and you only use specialty malts sparingly, and you have a definite purpose for each of the specialty malts. And we're going to walk through specialty malts in a minute, talk about flavors and so on, but you should really have a purpose in mind when you put something into your beer. You shouldn't just throw stuff into your beer because you think it might look good or taste good. The second point is to avoid the harsh zone malts. I'm going to spend a lot of time on that in the next slide, so I won't spend a lot of time on it here, but there's certain malts that have a harsh flavor profile, and you want to have those, you want to avoid those malts or use those malts very sparingly when you're working with your beer. The next concept I want to talk about is flavor and depth first and color last, and particularly for extract brewers or new brewers that are just starting to design their own first recipes. You really want to focus on the flavor of the malt and the flavor of the specialty ingredients that you're using, and not worry so much about the precise color and stuff like that. In fact, you can add color really easy just by adding some really dark, really small amounts of really dark malt that hardly changes the flavor at all if you're worried about color. But a good example is a lot of first time beer designers will say, I'm going to make a brown malt and I throw my ingredients in, it's not dark enough, and I'm going to throw some like Crystal 100 in it. Well, Crystal 100 is like right in the middle of that harsh zone that we were talking about. And so now you've thrown off the flavor profile of the whole beer. Another concept that goes with that is the depth in your beer comes from combining different malt flavors. So, when I was first starting to brew, we did sort of, what you might call the kitchen sink porter, where you sort of pick every single malt you got laying around, you make a porter out of it, right? And it ends up very muddled and kind of messy. but it doesn't have much depth of flavor to it. You actually get depth of flavor by picking malts from different groups. And we're going to talk about the malt groups on the next slide. But if you specifically pick different malts from different groups and you combine those, now you can get that depth that you might imagine from something like a porter. So, you know, like if you go to a lot of bars, and I like dark beers, so I quite often I'll order a porter or a stout or something like that. And you taste a porter, quite often it's got like one dark malt in it. It's got chocolate malt or black patent malt, and that's it. And so that's all you taste when you taste the beer is black patent malt. And I don't like that kind of beer. I actually like, you know, malt that has depth to it. So it's got layers of flavor to it, you know, if you will. And the way you get that is exactly what I was describing. You actually combine different malts from different groups. And then the last point is consider, you know, steeping or steeping your roast malts. And the concept here is if you imagine taking your malts, if you imagine taking coffee and making coffee in a conventional percolator and leaving it in the percolator to percolate for like over an hour, you're going to get some really harsh tannins and bitter kind of harsh flavors extracted into your coffee, right? And the same concept applies here. This is from Gordon Strong's book. But Gordon says, well, if you don't want those harsh flavors, so let's say you know, a good example is, let's say you're making an Irish stout. Well, if I'm making an Irish stout, maybe I want those harsh coffee flavors. So I'm going to throw the malts right into the mash, and I'm going to leave them there for an hour, and everything's going to be good. Well, let's say I'm making something more mild, like a sweet stout. Well, if I'm making a sweet stout, I may not want to leave those malts in the mash tun for that long time, because I'm going to get a lot of those harsh flavors pulled out. And it turns out the really dark malts, they don't add a lot of a huge amount of fermentables. They mainly add flavor and color to the beer. And so steeping them is perfectly appropriate. So what you do is you simply steep your roast malts either in a separate tea, or the modern method is really to just add them at the end of the mash. So you basically sprinkle your dark malts on the mash tun at the end of the mash, and then you go on with your normal sparging process, and you'll pull out much less of those harsh flavors and get sort of a milder, dark flavor to your beer. Okay, I'm going to spend a minute on this one because I think this is actually important. But this is a color wheel, of course, put together by Randy Mosher. I mentioned he's a graphic artist. Excuse me one second. A little cough there. So what we have here is the 4 basic malt groups. We have base malts, which is the lighter pale malts, which includes things like Vienna, pale malt, mild malt, and so on. We have kilned, or sometimes they're called colored malts. That includes things like ambers, biscuits, aromatic malts, melanoidin malts, all the way up to brown malt. And then we have caramel and crystal malts are in the center, which are made by a slightly different method, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And then finally, you have the roast and black malts, which are things like pale chocolate, chocolate malt, the carafas, black patent malt. And I don't have it on here, but roast barley is another one, although roast barley is made in a slightly different way. It's actually just raw barley that's burnt to a crisp. It's not technically a malt. But anyway, so this is the color wheel, and you can see there's a region roughly between 70 levibon and 200 levibon that is basically what we call the harsh zone. And there's not much malt made in this harsh zone. You don't see like super dark brown malt. You don't see like super pale chocolate malt, and so on. And there's only a couple of caramel malts that are made in that range. And the reason is because the malts in that range are particularly harsh. They have a lot of burnt flavors to them. And some of the flavors you get out of this harsh zone are things like, burnt marshmallows, burnt toast, really harsh tannins. When I say tannins, think of sucking on a tea bag, is sort of the tannic flavor, if you will. And you get a lot of these burnt, really harsh flavors in this zone. And so you try and avoid the harsh zone. If you're going to add things from the harsh zone, like if you're going to use 100 levibon crystal or something, you want to use it in really smart percentages, or you're going to really throw off the flavor of your beer. Okay, so I'm going to walk through real quick how these malts are created, because it's important to understand. So if you think about the basic malting process, the malting process starts with raw grains. Okay, the raw grains are wetted. So they're wetted until what happens when you take a seed and you wet it? Of course, it's going to get they actually immerse them in water is what they do. It's going to actually start to grow. So each of these malts or raw barley will actually start to grow. and you'll have a little shootlet, a little green shootlet coming out of the top of the grain. And inside the grain, it'll form another leafy thing called an acrospire. And when that gets to about the length of the grain, that's when we stop the malting process. And this was traditionally done on floors. So a lot of times they would literally, take the grain, get it really wet till it's up to like 80 or 90% water content, and they would lay it out on the floor and they would allow it to, it's called floor malting, and they would allow it to grow until the acrospire inside the thing gets about the length of the grain cell. Now we're going to actually cut it off by drying it. And so they put the malt into a kiln and they dry it by putting a lot of hot air through it. And that dries it back down to about 10% water content or something like that. And at that point, it's stable again, and they tumble it in a as they're kilning it, which gives rid of the little leaves. They just fall off and they throw them away. But if you do that, you end up with base malts, basically. And depending on the temperature that you use to dry it, you can end up with really pale base malts like Pilsner, or you can end up with something more like a pale malt, up to the Vienna and Munich malts, which are done just a little bit darker. And then if we take that same malt and we then, let's say we dried it out and then we raise the temperature up to toast it, you basically get into the kilned malt group, which is on the right side there. And so depending on how dark or how high you turn the temperature up, you can toast it and make these nice kiln malts, everything from amber roughly to brown malt. And then, of course, if you take your malt and you kind of put it in an oven at very high temperature, you can make the really dark malts, the roasted malts, which includes pale chocolate, carafa, black patent, all those other ones. And then finally, you notice the group in the middle, caramel malts are made using a slightly different technique. What we do with caramel malts is we actually take the malt and we bring it up. We leave it wet. So you take the malt, you leave it wet, you heat it up to roughly mashing temperature, which is about the same temperature that you guys use, 65 degrees C, I think it is, 155 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. And you leave it there for a while. And what happens to the caramel malt is it actually mashes inside the grain husk itself. And you end up with sugars being developed. And that's why caramel malt is sweeter than the other malts, because essentially you've mashed the grain, you've created these simple sugars inside of the malt itself, inside of the kernel or the husk. And then, of course, you can heat those again as you dry them out to make the darker caramel malts and crystal malts. So those are the 4 malt groups, and that's kind of how they all fit together. And we'll talk a little more about harsh zone as we go, but these, those are the 4 basic malt groups, and you can use them in different ways because they all have very different flavor profiles. So we'll talk a little bit about flavors now. This is a typical malt data sheet. This is from Breeze, so you can actually pull these up online now. It's kind of neat. They're one of the few places I think that produces these sensory profile spider graphs that you can see on the right. They're very commonly used for hops, but some of the maltsters have started publishing for malts as well, and they're kind of useful. So it gives you an idea of the flavor profile that you're going to get from this particular malt. This is Breeze Pale Malt. It's, moderately sweet, moderately malty. It's a pretty neutral malt, really. On the left side, just a couple points to make. The extract fine grain dry basis is the yield you can expect from the malt by weight. So if I take this malt and I mash it, in ideal conditions, in an ideal laboratory, I might get 80% by weight of the points extracted from that turns it eventually into original gravity in my beer. Now, we're all working with real systems, so we don't actually get that 80%. That's sort of an ideal number. But we do get a percentage of that, which is called the brew house efficiency for if you're familiar with the equipment profiles in BeerSmith, you get a percentage of that. So I might actually get like 75% efficiency on my system. So that means 75% of that 80% turns into original gravity points in the beer. And if you apply that across all the malts, that's how you get your original gravity estimate. Just sort of a little bit of trivia there. Other things to be concerned about from the data sheet are protein. Depending on the style of the beer you're making, protein does add body to your beer, but it also affects the clarity of your beer. So if you're trying to make something really clean and clear like a Kolsch, you might want to start paying attention to how much protein the malt you're working with has. Another one is the diastatic power. That's actually a measure of how much enzymes you have in the malt. Not a big deal for all grain brewers because all the malts we work with today are extremely enzymatic, which means they're called well modified, which means they have a huge amount of enzymes. But if you're like a partial mash brewer, for example, you're just getting into all grain brewing, you might be concerned about this because you want to make sure you have enough enzymes in your partial mash to convert everything. And then of course the color you guys are familiar with. Talk briefly about some of the flavors you get. So base malts are pale, Pilsner, mild, Vienna. And they tend to be malty, of course. They have a white bread, cracker flavors. Mild and Vienna have hints of caramel or toast in them. But very different finish than some of the colored malts we're going to talk about in a minute. When we get into the caramel malts, you're familiar with these probably from tasting a lot of British beers. Use quite a bit of caramel malt in them. They tend to add a lot of fruity flavors as well as the caramel flavors, some sweetness to the beer as well. Carapils or carafoam is generally neutral. It really doesn't add much except some body and foam and protein to the beer. As you get into the light caramel malts, you get caramel aroma, apricots, raisins, and figs. When you think about a fruity English beer, for example, part of the fruit comes from the use of the caramel malts. Part of it comes from the use of the English yeasts. And we'll talk more about yeast in a minute. But these are kinds of flavors you get. You get the light fruit flavors out. As you get into the medium malts, we're talking like 40 Lebanon or so, you start to get already some of the toast and burnt sugar flavors in there, the toasted marshmallow flavors. If you use them sparingly, you get the dried fruit flavors. You get the figs, the raisins, the prune flavors start to come out. And then when we get to the dark caramel malts, of course, these are pretty much the only malts that are made in that harsh zone. But now, you're getting really the intense burnt sugar flavors, the Turkish coffee, intense bitterness, all this other stuff starts to come out. And when you're working with these dark caramel malts, you want to be really careful because they're in that harsh zone. I recommend you keep it down to maybe just a couple % of your overall grain bill. Otherwise, you're going to get these really harsh flavors out of the beer. Caramel malts. Colored malts includes things like Munich, which is also used as a base malt, obviously, amber malts, honey malts, melanoidin malts, brown malts. A lot of these are underutilized by brewers, but they can add some really unique flavors to your beer and really work well in a lot of darker beer styles. Munich and honey give you caramel or cookie bites. I've even seen people make cookie flavored beer, believe it or not, you can make if you use enough of this stuff. Amber and melanoidin give you more of a biscuit finish to the beer. So you get the biscuit, the toasty, the brown chocolate flavors. You get a little bit of caramel sweetness, but not anywhere near what you get with the caramel malts, and you don't get the fruity raisin flavors. So when you think about working with color malts, they're like caramel malts, but without the fruity flavors, which can be quite nice in a lot of beers. And then of course, when you get to the brown malt, you're on the edge of the harsh zone again. So now you start to get these mocha, chocolate, toasty, flavors. And you also get, if you use too much brown malt, you're going to get into this harsh zone type flavors again. And then finally, roasted malts, there's chocolate, carafa, black, roast barley, and so on. A lot of people don't realize that light chocolate malt is actually harsher and sharper than chocolate malt because it's closer to that harsh zone we were talking about. And chocolate malt is even a little more harsh than black patent malt, which you wouldn't think. They have a different flavor profile. The black patent malt gives you more of the coffee, espresso flavors because it's so much darker. But the chocolate malt can be a little bit more sharp and piercing. And so you want to actually use maybe a little bit less chocolate malt than you might a black patent malt if you're making a similar beer. And then I mentioned roast barley is actually not technically a malt. It's made with just barley. But it gives you that dry, acrid flavor. If you think about a Guinness beer, that comes almost entirely from roast barley. I'm going to dive into hops for a minute and hop tips and techniques. The first point here is aroma is the main way you select hops. So, I've sat down a number of times with a number of professional brewers, sit around the table, and the way they sample hops is they'll open a whole bunch of packets of hops and they will take them in their hands, kind of like this. Well, you crush them up first. You crush the hops up if they're pelletized or whatever, use a spoon or something to crush them up. And then you take them in your hands, you put a little bit in your hands and you rub them together like this, and then you literally get your nose right up into the hops and get a really good whiff of the hops. And that's pretty much how you determine whether the hops are fresh or not. And I've done this a whole bunch of times now. And some interesting things you'll find if you get a couple different hop varieties and open up the pack, it's a fun thing to do with the club. You'll find that some of the hops are really fresh and really popping because they were picked at just the right time and they were packaged in just the right way, and they were, the aromas all there and everything. And then you'll find probably several packets of hops that are not popping at all, and in fact taste quite stale. And this is just the nature of the beast. Not every hop variety is going to be perfect every time. Some of them are picked at the wrong time. Some of them got wet at some point. Some of them weren't packaged properly or stored properly or whatever. So they're not going to have that same popping aroma flavor. One of the things I encourage you to do is before you go brew, 30 liters or 40 liters of beer, open the hop packets. I'm talking about before you even start brewing. Open the hop packets up and make sure they're fresh before you start brewing your beer. Because a lot of people don't do that. They just start brewing their beer and they dump the hops in when it's time. And you have no idea if you just added really lousy hops to your really nice beer. So do that up front. But when you're picking hops for your beer, particularly if you're making something like an IPA or something that's got a lot of hoppy aroma to it, be selective. Maybe get a couple different varieties and actually sample them first and see which one's popping before you go and dump it in your beer. And maybe save the one that isn't popping for, a different beer, something that's not hop forward, for example. Most of us have moved to a single boil edition now, and I'm going to show you on the next slide why that is. But a lot of these shorter boil editions really don't add much to the beer, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. And to preserve hop aroma, most of us have moved to whirlpool, steep, or dry hops. So for homebrewers, that generally means steeping your beer after you've turned the flame out, after you've turned the heat off, if you will. What you want to do is, professional brewers have this system called a whirlpool, where it actually whirlpools the hops in the bottom of the kettle, which is kind of nice. But you can do the same thing by steeping your hops after flame out, and then dry hopping, of course. And that preserves the aroma oils, as we're going to show in a minute, but it doesn't add a lot of bitterness. And then finally, I want to mention that aroma oils fade with time. So if you talk to like Vinny at Russian River, one of the top IPA makers in the US here in California, they don't serve much beer outside of their tap room. And the reason they do that is because they like the beer to be fresh. We had an event out there, and Vinny actually served beer that was bottled, canned that day, literally. So it was canned that morning, and he brought it to us for lunch. But the reason is because the hop aromas are very fragile, and they do fade over time. And literally within a couple of weeks, you'll always see a noticeable difference if you compare it to a very fresh beer. And within a few months, most of that hop aroma oil is gone. So that's why, particularly for the big IPAs, we've moved to that. This is why most of us have moved to a single boil edition. And it's because we used to do like these 5-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute so-called aroma editions. And we used to do these 30-minute flavor editions. But what we found now through science is that these are what I'm showing you here is the aroma compounds. And so I'm not sure if you quite read it because it's all getting sent over the internet here, but the top left is myrcene, linalool, geraniol, humulene, caryophyllene, and humulene. These are some of the major hop oils that add aroma to your hops. If we look at, say, for example, the top left is myrcene. Within 10 minutes, roughly 2/3 of that aroma oil is gone if you boil it. So if I'm doing a boil edition to try and get, preserve aroma, and even if I do a 5-minute edition, I've already lost 1/3 of the aroma oils. And then of course you're going to lose more as the thing ferments and all this other, later in the process. So really not an efficient way to get aroma oils into the beer. So most of us have moved to doing a single boil edition, or, sometimes we use a blend, but, basically a boil edition, get the IBU level we want, and then we move to aroma or dry hops to get the aroma that we want. So I'm going to walk briefly through some of the different groups and talk about some of the flavors you might get from these groups, just to understand kind of how we look at different hops. So this is a noble hops group. Most of these come from Central Europe. So you think about the Germanic hops, the hops used in Vienna beers. A lot of Belgian beers use these hops. Of course, the noble groups are actually bred for aroma and have been for hundreds of years, actually. They vary from dry to herbaceous to minty and spicy. If you think about something like a Saaz, it's got some spicy notes to it for sure. But you do get some fruity and citrus notes out of some of the different styles. And so some of the ones you would include in here is Saaz, Howler Tower, you're probably familiar with. Liberty, Pearl, Hersbrucker, Strisselspalt. Yeah, these are all traditionally grown in Europe, and they have a definite profile that we call them noble hops group. Next is the Britannic group. One of my personal flavor. I like a lot of the English beers myself, but these are very different from the noble group. These are earthy. They're spicy. They have a lot of woody flavors to them, herbal flavors to them, grassy, sometimes even lawnmower flavors. If you use too much Fuggles and boil it too long, you can get lawnmower flavors in your beer, which in some cases is good, some cases bad. So these were used in traditional British IPAs, pale ales, milds, probably a lot of the beers that you're familiar with. And the classic example is arguably East Kent Goldings, which I use a lot of. But there's Golding, Whitbread, Willamette, Fuggles are actually related. Northdown, and of course Northern Brewer, which is a little bit distinctive, used in Anchor steam beer. But they definitely have more of an earthy flavor when you take the complex fruity flavors you get out of the hops. I'm sorry, out of the yeast that you use for a British beer. You combine it with these earthy hops, and you get the complexity you might think about in a traditional English pale ale. The next group's the Cascade group. These come out of the Pacific Northwest in the United States, and they're really the soul of American IPAs. So this is really driving the craft beer revolution. Over half the craft beer brewed in the United States now are IPAs. So these are the hops that drive that really. So these are different hops. They do have some unique characteristics to them. They have thiols in them, which the European hops actually don't. Only the American hops or hops derived from America, including the Australian, New Zealand, which we'll talk about in a minute, have thiols in them. They also are high in a lot of these aroma oils that we talked about, like myrcene is a classic sort of piney flavor that's big in Cascade, for example. So they're piney and they're citrusy. They have floral and herbal components. They have some fruity flavors, not quite as much as some of the New Zealand ones, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I mean, these are you can literally name the hops and you can name the beer. I mean, Cascade is Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. Centennial's used in Bell's Two Hearted, which is a big IPA out of the Midwest. Simcoe is used by Russian River, and so on and so on. Mosaic is very popular right now too. But these are hops that are big in aroma oils and big in flavor. And next we have the Pacific group. And these are, when I say Pacific group, I mean primarily New Zealand and Australia is where these hops are grown. These are Pacific Northwest hops. So these hops actually have heritage to the Pacific Northwest of the United States. But they have a unique character because of where they're grown. So this includes things like Citra, Galaxy, Moteca. At least here in the United States, these are some of the hardest hops to get. And they're very desirable because they have a lot of fruity flavors to them. So they have a lot of geraniol, which gives you a lot of this fruity finish to the beer that is used a lot in New England IPAs, for example. But they give you apricots, grapes, gooseberry, white wines. Some are even named after wines, Nelson Sauvin. And a lot of these fruity flavors, along with a lot of the aroma oils you'll see from the Pacific Northwest hops. And that final group here is the bittering only hops. These are hops that are bred primarily for alpha content. A lot of these came out of programs in the 70s and 80s by the big breweries here in the United States and other places to create hops that would put as much alpha acid per acre as possible. So basically their whole idea here was to get hops that are very high alpha content so that they can be turned into hop extract and be used for bittering large commercial beers like Budweiser and Michelob and stuff like that. So, a lot of these have fallen out of favor now, but there's a huge variety of them available, and they're very suitable for bittering, not used so much for their aroma content. And then I wanted to mention just a little bit on sort of trending hop techniques, some of the new techniques that are being used here in the United States to make some of these fruity IPAs. When you think about tropical fruity flavors in hops and things like New England IPAs that have a lot of these fruity flavors in them, very popular here in the United States. There's been a lot of research done in this now. Recent research that I got from Stan and done at a number of universities, Japan and some in the Midwest, some in the West, have found that geraniol, linalool play a critical role. So you want to pick hops that are high in the geraniol, high in the linalool, and then thiols are absolutely critical. So you actually can't use European hops to get a lot of these fruity flavors. You need to use either the Pacific Northwest hops or the hops from Australia, New Zealand. And so these thiols play a critical role in delivering this fruit flavor. And so not surprisingly, if you pull up some of the top hops like Citra, Mosaic, Moteca, and so on, they have the thiols, they have the geraniol, they have a lot of those characteristics, which is why they end up getting used in a lot of these IPAs. And the other technique that's been used is you take these hops that are high in geraniol and you start using them in dry hopping during fermentation. And you don't want to do it too early in fermentation. It turns out you actually lose most of the aroma oil if you do it too early in the fermentation, because the CO2 bubbling literally pushes the aroma oils out, or the aromas out. I should mention this, aroma oils are hard to get into your beer because they're not soluble, right? If they were soluble, they wouldn't be aroma oils. They would just sit in the beer, right? So if they were soluble compounds, they would sit in the beer and they would never come out and you'd never smell them. They have to be sort of insoluble. So that means they're hard to get in the beer. So that's why we go through all these gyrations to get these aroma oils into our beer by exposing them for a long time or at higher temperature or whatever. So anyways, you can actually play with fermenting late in the fermentation. You get biotransformations going on with this geraniol that creates a lot of these fruity flavors if you're interested in doing that. I'm going to switch to yeast. I'm not going to spend quite as much time on yeast and water, but yeast flavors are interesting. First of all, just 2 points here. Yeast flavors are usually show up as off flavors, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But things like esters, acetaldehyde, and so on tend to show up as in your beer. So that means that yeast health is absolutely essential. So you want to pitch enough yeast up front. If you're working with dry yeast, you want to hydrate it properly. If you're working with liquid yeast, usually you want a starter. You want to aerate with oxygen if possible, and you can buy these oxygen wands now that make it very easy for homebrewers to use pure oxygen to aerate your beer. You want to control the temperature if you can, or at least moderate the temperature variations, and of course use good sanitation. And why do you want to do all that? Well, it's right here. This is off the Beer Judge certification score sheet that we use here to score beers in the United States, and these are all the off flavors from the left side of the score sheet. I kind of clipped it there in the bottom right, but you can see quite a few of them are caused by yeast. Acetaldehyde is incomplete fermentation. Alcoholic usually comes from fermenting too hot. Diacetyl, which is a buttier flavor, comes from not allowing the yeast to clean up at the end, and so on and so on. So yeast health is very, very important to your beer. We're just going to quickly walk through the popular yeast groups. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but English ales, I mentioned, tend to give you a dirtier finish, if you will. So they're high in esters. They're going to create a lot of fruity flavors in your beer. They're lower in attenuation. So typically you're going to end up with a higher finishing gravity, which means you're going to end up with a little more malty finish as well. And then the higher fermentation temperatures where they're fermented, gives you things like higher order alcohols and so on that give you the complexity of if you think about a hand pumped English ale, for example. California ale yeast is kind of the opposite of that. It's a very high attenuation, clean fermenting, fast fermenting ale yeast. And so it gives you sort of a clean finish to your beer. And that fits in well with a lot of where you're trying to highlight things like the American pale ales, the IPAs, and it's a lot of these hop forward beers. You want a clean finish on the beer where it accentuates the hops. German ale yeast have a lot of variety to them. You have clean versions like a Kolsch. A Kolsch is an ale technically, but it tastes almost like a lager. To the alt styles that are going to accentuate more of the malts. German wheat yeast, I just wanted to mention, the banana clove flavor that you get in a German wheat beer, if you German wheat beer. The clove flavor comes almost entirely from that yeast. The yeast produces a huge amount of phenolics, and the phenolics give you that clove finish that really is a dominant finish or dominant flavor in a Weizen beer. from Germany. Belgian wheat yeast is also phenolic, but it has some spice to it. It gives you a different finish on the beer than the German wheat yeast because it balances the phenolics with sweetness, if you will. I enjoy a good wit. And then Belgian ale yeast, there's a huge amount of variation. You know, Trappist yeasts are kind of fruity. They produce a lot of esters in them versus you got something like a Saison that has a lot of phenolics in it and spice that gives you this sort of that farmhouse ale finish. You know, Belgium is kind of like the Disneyland of beers. There's like 100 different varieties in a couple square miles there, I think. Anyways, that's it for yeast. I'm not going to dive into all the lager yeast and so on, but there's, you know, understanding some of the off flavors that come from the yeast and then looking at the flavor profiles. Actually, one thing I did want to mention about yeast, I didn't know this, but you can pull up White Labs, for example, has a, I don't know if you guys get White Labs yeast. Do you get them? Maybe Trevor can tell me. You get them? Okay. So White Labs yeast, Chris White, good friend of mine, talked to him about a week ago. But White Labs yeast, you can actually scan, they have a number on the package and you can go to their website. I think it's Yeastman is the name of it or something like that. And you can pull up the individual stats for that particular batch of yeast, including the off flavors that are produced by it. He does a lab test on everything, which is kind of interesting. So you can go to Yeastman and you can pull up their yeast and you get an exact profile for that yeast. And it includes a lot of these things like how much diacetyl it produces and how much acetaldehyde it produces and things like that. Kind of interesting. Okay, so last thing I'm going to do is dive into water. I'm going to do this very compressed. So there's only, I got like 2 slides on water, maybe 3 slides on water. And I know I've gone a little long, I apologize, but the first point is you really should understand what your starting water profile is. So if you're working with water, particularly if you're an all grain brewer, and I'll mention extract for just a minute. If you're an extract brewer, I'm going to argue that the guy that made the malt extract probably did the water chemistry for you already because they did the mash for you already, right? So if you're working with malt extract, the way malt extract is produced by just like a conventional all grain beer is. Except they go through this all grain mashing process. They produce malt and then they boil the malt down basically under a vacuum to lower the temperature, but they boil the malt down to produce liquid extract or dry malt extract, if you will. So they've done the water chemistry for you already. So if you're an extract brewer, you can actually just start with something like RO water or distilled water and mix the extract in and your water chemistry is pretty much done. Now, the next couple slides, however, apply to all grain brewers. So if you're an all grain brewer, you do want to understand your water profile that you're starting with. So the best way to do that is do a water test, and there's water test kits you can get, or you can send it off to a lab to be done. Generally, the lab is going to give you slightly more accuracy, and it's also cheaper if you're just doing one test. But a proper brewing water test, here in the US, we get Ward Labs. I don't know if you get that, but there's a couple different labs that provide those tests. And you send off your water sample and you get a numbers back accurately. Sometimes you can get them from your local water source. It just depends. The second point is you do want to be concerned about your mash pH if you're an all grain brewer, particularly as you get more experienced. You want to try and make sure your mash pH is in the 5.2 to 5.6 range. And the way this works is your water typically out of the faucet is slightly alkaline. And if you remember your high school chemistry test, or water starts at a pH of about 7, okay? And if you go below 7, it's acidic. If you go above 7, it's considered alkaline. So water at your taps usually a little bit alkaline because it's come out of the ground. And then you're going to mix malt in, and malt is acidic. So malt is actually going to drive the pH down. So as you mix the water with the malt, it's going to drive the pH down. You'd like to get your pH down into the 5.2 to 5.6 range. The darker the malt, the more acidic it is. So if I'm brewing a really dark beer like a Irish stout, a lot of times I won't even worry about the mash pH because it's probably going to be in that good range anyways. There's enough dark malt there to drive it all the way down to where I need to be. However, if you are brewing a lighter beer, you're not going to have as much acidity in there. So now you have to start thinking about maybe adding some acid to your mash to get it down to the right pH range. Okay. Typically, most homebrewers work with lactic acid. You can also use phosphoric acid, citric acid. There's a bunch of different acids you can use. And there's 2 ways you can estimate how to adjust your mash pH. One is, there's 2 ways to do this. One is to mix everything in and then take a pH reading, use a pH meter. and then do an adjustment from there. And there's calculators online or in BeerSmith that'll tell you how much lactic acid to add to get roughly down into the range you want to be. Or the other option is to use software up front to estimate what your mash pH might be, and then use the software also to guess how much lactic acid to come in. Now, the first point I want to make is none of these models are perfect. The other point I want to make is if you think about mashing in, okay, if I'm going to take, I don't know, I'm working with like 20 pounds of grain, 10 kilograms of grain or something like that in a 40 kilogram batch. If I think about heating up the water and then mixing all that in and then getting it stabilized to where I can take a pH reading, get all the dough balls out and all that stuff, that process probably takes me about 20 minutes. And I mentioned earlier that all of our pale malts today are highly modified, which means they have a huge amount of enzymes in them. One of the problems is a lot of that mash conversion can take place during that 20 minutes. A lot of that sugar conversion can take place during that 20 minutes while I'm mashing in. So if I use the philosophy of, well, I'm going to just take a measurement and use that, by the time I take that measurement, a lot of the conversion sugars may have already taken place. So I actually don't like to do that. So I use a hybrid method. What I do is I will use software to estimate how much lactic acid to put in. I'll put some of that in up front, right, to get me down in the good range. And then I'll dough in, take a second measurement with a pH meter, and now I'll dial it in and add a little more lactic acid to get where I want to be. So that's about it on mash pH, but gives you an idea of how to do it. And there's software and there's articles online. I've written a bunch of articles online on how to do that. And then the last point I'll make about water is just understand your sulfate to chloride ratio. And sulfate to chloride is simply the sulfate content. It's one of those big six ions I'm going to talk about in the next slide, and divided by your chloride content in your beer. And that gives you an idea of how balanced your beer is. So and you can play with this by adding, calcium chloride or whatever you want to get your beer either more bitter or more malty, depending on the style of beer you're making. Get your water either more malty or more bitter, depending on the style of beer you're making. So this is another thing you play with in the software, but you can build water profiles that, if you're building an IPA, that actually enhance the bitterness of the beer. These are the big six ions I was talking about, the water report. And I'm not going to I'll walk through them really quickly. I'm going to walk through them in pairs. So first pair we're going to talk about is calcium and bicarbonate. So the top one and the bottom one. Those are the good ranges shown there. So calcium, I'd like it in the 50 to 150 part range. Okay. So calcium is actually going to acidify the mash. So if I add more calcium, it's going to acidify the mash, which means it's going to lower the mash pH, which is a good thing in most cases when I'm brewing beer. If I have too much bicarbonates on the other end of things, bicarbonates are alkaline, so they're going to raise the pH. So generally, if my water is very high in bicarbonates, it's going to make it harder and harder for me to get that mash pH down. I'm going to have to add more lactic acid. Generally, not good for the beer, but it does also enhance the bitterness of the beer. So that's something you can play with too if you want to use a lot of bicarbonates. And there are some traditional water profiles that have a lot of bicarbonates in them. But those are the good ranges for those two. Next two I'm going to mention are magnesium and sodium together. Magnesium is actually a trace element. It's majorly used to feed your yeast a little bit. So you just need a little bit in there. Sodium, you want to avoid having too much sodium in the beer because it can create off flavors, but it will enhance the sweetness or body in dark beers. So you can actually bump it up a little bit in the dark beers. And then finally, the last two are, of course, are sulfate and chloride, which we talked about on the last slide. You take the ratio of those two, and now you can either enhance the bitterness of your beer, or you can enhance the maltiness of the beer. So if I drive up the chloride, it's going to be more malty. If I drive up the sulfate, it's going to be more bitter. Okay. So that's a crash course in playing with your water. You can obviously learn more about that. I've got hours worth of stuff I could present at some point in the future on water, and you could go into detail on each one of these. But that gives you an idea of how to work with that. So my summary is, combine different flavors to get depth in your beer. Avoid using harsh zone malts or use them sparingly, usually with a purpose. So if I'm trying to get depth in the beer, I might add just a little bit of that, one of those harsh zone malts, but I'm not going to add more than a couple percent. Dry rub your hops before you work with it. Use the appropriate yeast. Manage your off flavors from your yeast. Yeast health is very important. And then, of course, we talked about water. Water makes up over 90% of your beer, so it is actually very, very important. And I got time for questions here. I did want to mention one other thing before I go to that, and I apologize for running a couple minutes long here, but I did put out 2 blog posts. If you go to beersmith.com/blog recently, one of them has an index to all of my podcasts. And I think there's 212 episodes or 213 episodes of the podcast there. And they're actually indexed by subject, which is kind of nice. If you want to hear like a whole speech on water or something. And then the other thing, if you go down just a couple posts from at the top of the blog there, I've got my newsletters and articles that I've written. And I think there's 360 of them indexed now by subject. So you can pull up articles on mash pH if you want, or articles on, I don't know, hops or aroma oils or just about anything you want. So I published those shortly after the quarantine started here, so people would have something to look at. But I just want to mention those 2. With that, I'll go to questions.
Thank you so much, Brad. That was fantastic. Really appreciate it. Let's ask the last question that's just come in first. I know Trevor's got all the questions to hand there, but this one is more relevant because we're just finished talking about water. So do you have any tips or techniques on brewing with rainwater?
To some degree, rainwater is not much different than any other water you get. So, I mean, it typically, a lot of times rainwater will have a little bit less alkalinity in it. But depending on how you collect it, you're going to collect some stuff with it. So it's still going to have some nutrients. It's not going to be purely, it's not 100% distilled, obviously.
Would you filter rainwater normally, or?
I don't know. Again, it depends on how you collect it. If you're collecting off the roof, yeah, I'd probably filter it. If you're collecting it in some semi-sterile way, I wouldn't have to worry about it. I wouldn't think.
Okay.
It'd be difficult to determine what the profile is, though.
Yeah, for sure. Let's get it tested.
Gee, we had a very nice kind of turnout here tonight, Brad. So thank you very, very much. It's been
my pleasure.
Fantastic. And thank you for that tour de force and that lovely walk through the whole science of beer and creating and designing the flavor profiles. The one question from Dan is there was talk of an update to BeerSmith 3. Is that in the pipeline soon?
Yeah, BeerSmith 3.1 is coming out. It's not an earth-shattering update. It is a whole bunch of stability updates. There's a number of new features. People wanted an alter. People were complaining about the mash pH model, so I've got a couple different mash pH models you can pick from now. There's some new hop tools in there. There's some additional features, but a lot of it is under the hood work. I've done a lot of work to move to a transaction-based database, which means all the data gets stored immediately when you change it, which is really nice. Because we had issues with people, not shutting down their laptops or whatever, and BeerSmith was saving data at the end. But the other thing it does is it lays the foundation for the future, which is going to be an online version of BeerSmith, which I've been working on for some time. In fact, the BeerSmith tools are already available online now from beersmithrecipes.com. If you're a gold member, you can access all the tools there. The recipe builder is something I'm working on, but also the sync across all the platforms is being done. And that's a big part of this 3.1 update. But there are a number of, really small features that people wanted that are getting added to that, as well as bug fixes, other stuff. And that's actually going to the beta testers this week. I finished, it's basically done now. So that's going out shortly. And then there'll be a small mobile update after that as well. Same sort of thing, stability, transaction-based stuff to make it a little bit easier to access. And then, of course, the online version is a big project I'm working on, and being able to sync across all the platforms, including your ingredients, your profiles, all that other stuff, is a big thing. But it's a substantial effort because there's like BeerSmith Recipes has a million recipes on it now and something like 250,000 users. So it's not just I'm doing millions of transactions every week. It's not just it's not just a couple guys with their beers anymore. So anyways, I'm sorry, it was a long answer.
So the retirement is going well.
I can't complain. I'm kind of happy. There's been one of the upsides. I mean, obviously this coronavirus thing is absolutely horrible and devastating, but one of the nice things is there has been a renewed interest in home brewing because people are stuck at home. So
there's been a serious
that's good.
Interest in home brewing in South Africa because we can't buy alcohol at all in the stores. So
yeah, I'm
even
sort of
more,
surprised at that.
Even
Here,
more so.
Here, the governor here declared the liquor stores to be essential.
Well, you guys have tried prohibition in the past; it didn't work so well, eh? So
No,
I guess you've learned from those previous lessons.
Yeah.
Dan also asked.
I've got two
okay.
quite nice. Go for it, Mike. You go, Mike.
If you had to add malted sorghum, what parameters would you use? Potential and color. So sorghum is a local grain to Africa, mostly to.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not the expert in that. I know a lot of gluten-free brewers actually use sorghum in their beer, and it is very commonly used for that. But I also know in order to use sorghum, I've done a couple of podcasts on gluten-free brewing, so you might want to listen to those. But I know in order to use sorghum, you also need to add enzymes typically to get it to mash out properly, because it does not have enough enzymes on its own to self-convert. So it's more complicated than just throwing in the potential and the so on. There was an add-on, I think, that one of the gluten-free brewers sent me that I think it's available in file add-ons at BeerSmith for some of the sort of so-called gluten-free base grains. And there might be a value in there that you can use. But again, I don't think you can just throw sorghum into your mash and have it all work perfectly, especially using it as a base malt. You actually do need to add some enzymes to it to make it work. And I'm not the expert on that, but
I think Julian in the chat also answered that question because he's brewed a gluten-free beer with sorghum, brewer in Joburg here. So yeah. Go, Trevor. Next question.
Yeah, I mean, we've got so many questions, and we don't want to keep you from your lockdown lunch. So
I got a few minutes.
But there's been a lot of interest recently in low alcohol beers. And John Horrocks was just asking about whether you've had experience in designing low alcohol beers.
Yeah,
and,
I mean, there's a couple different techniques they use to get low alcohol beers. Obviously, they typically are shooting for very high attenuation in the beer. They start with a very low gravity beer to start with, typically. So one of the tricks is you're basically watering down the beer, if you will. I mean, that's one of the basic techniques. The other technique I've seen used, and I can't recall the exact enzyme, but they do use enzymes a lot of times to enhance the fermentability of the beer to get the gravity down in the finished beer. A particular enzyme, I can't remember the name of it, but there is an enzyme you can use to lower the final gravity of the beer. They even use it in IPAs here. They make something called a champagne IPA. I don't know if you've heard of it. Which is made with enzymes, again, to drive the gravity way down. So you basically got a beer with very low gravity, but
the Brut IPA kind of took off here and then died about as quickly as it took off.
Kind of like Zima or something.
Yeah.
Any experience in using wild yeasts at all? There was one question, which is a very interesting area for me.
I have drank a lot of wild yeast beers because people bring them to me quite often. They can be quite enjoyable. So, I mean, typically what you end up with wild yeast is you end up with a yeast that, you typically end up with a mix of yeast and bacteria. And so you end up with some of the sour off flavors as well as some of the traditional, beer flavors, if you will. So typically you end up with a beer that's just a little bit on the sour side, which can be quite nice if you design the beer correctly. It's a lot of people are absolutely wild about sour beers. So, I mean, that's typically what you get when we're working with wild yeast is you're going to get a combination of bacteria and yeast that create these interesting flavors. So, I mean, they can be quite good. There's no specific, I would say, if you want to think about making a beer with wild yeast, I would say, think about making a light sour beer. That's kind of what you're doing if you're designing one.
A little question from...
Go on, Trevor.
No, just a question for me. Have you had any experience in using South African hops? We're pretty proud, I think, most people about Southern Passion. It's a hops that AB InBev or its predecessor South African breweries developed here in South Africa.
So what varieties do you have? I have not used them here.
Well, I think the hop variety that most people are fond of is something called Southern Passion.
I have heard of that.
There are a few.
African Queen is very popular here as well.
I've heard of African Queen as well. I think the issue is they're just not widely available here. We have.
There is a company that
if I go to
imports them.
local, if I go to local homebrew store, typically it's going to have all the Pacific Northwest hops and a few of the English hops. And
yeah, I think the most important question I've just seen on here is, what are you drinking, Brad?
At the moment, I'm drinking. It's kind of sad. I'm drinking iced tea, but
it looks like beer. Looks a bit
typically,
like beer.
it's just. Unfortunately, it's just iced tea. It's still early in the day. I got to get a little work done before I can dive into it. But I don't know. Yesterday was Cinco de Mayo, so I had margaritas yesterday. But I'm a big fan of dark beers. So typically, if I pull a beer myself and it's for me, I'll pull a dark beer. So I like porters and stouts and all those wonderful flavors. The other thing I enjoy very much and I've gotten into is mead making.
Oh, wow.
And the meads that I make are all giant fruit meads, which are, if you think about, say 20 pounds of honey and maybe 10 pounds of fruit and a little bit of water in a 19-liter batch, that's the kind of mead that I like to make. The starting gravity is as high as 1150, not 1050, 1150.
Wow.
Nice.
So
what
very enjoyable.
What yeast are you using there? Are you using
I like my favorite.
yeast?
My favorite for mead is something called 71B. It's Narbonne yeast from Lallemand. And it has several unique characteristics that make it very nice for big fruit meads. Now, keep in mind, the fruit meads, I'm starting at these insanely high gravities because I'm going to ferment them down maybe to 1030 something. So
Wow.
the finishing gravity is going to be like 1032 or 4, or depending on the fruit that I'm working with. And the fruit, because I'm using massive amounts of fruit, has a lot of acidity to it. So what you have is you have this really high finishing gravity with a lot of sweetness to it, balanced by a huge amount of acidity from the fruit. And so it creates this really rich, dark complexity to it. So I didn't mean to go on a tirade about meads, but.
No, but meads are very popular in the States. And I think even one of our local mead producers here exports a lot of their meads to you guys. But one of the questions was, apart from meads being popular, what are the trends that you see in craft beer in the US right now?
Well, at the moment, nothing's really changed on the IPA side. There's just IPAs are dominating the market, and people are constantly coming out with new IPAs. New England IPAs are probably one of the favorite styles around here right now, which of course are those kind of cloudy, fruity, a lot of them have these sort of fruity flavors to them. And I mean, if you get a good one, they are quite delicious. They really are nice. And then, I hate to say it, but the big brewers have been playing with like every variant of IPA. In fact, when I go to the West Coast, I get a little frustrated because I enjoy an IPA, don't get me wrong, but I'll order like a porter out in California and it's not really a porter, it's a dark IPA, because they don't know how to make anything except an IPA. So it's kind of, it's gotten a little crazy here really with the IPAs. And which I mean, they're amazing beers, but it's, there are so many other styles to enjoy. So still the dominant, if you go to any craft brewery in the United States, over 50% of the beers that they make, well over 50% of the beer they make is IPAs now. So
you mentioned sours as well in your talk, quite popular now. Sours
are quite popular. The challenge with sours is if you're making anything but a sort of a light Berliner Weiss, it takes a lot of time to make a really good sour. And so the challenge you have is, producing them in large quantities. If you're making like a really nice aged sour, which are utterly fantastic and enjoyable, it's kind of hard to produce them on a mass quantity, if you will. They tend to be more of a limited release. Like I had, what's his name? Michael, you want to say Fairbrother? Michael Tonsmeyer on a while ago, and he makes a lot of sours. He's got a commercial brewery now, and he makes a lot of sours. But he can't do it on a mass scale. It's kind of hard to do.
I think we listened to a talk from Fal Allen, Anderson Valley Brewing. They kind of specialize in sours. So
Yeah, I mean, you can do a kettle sour very quickly,
Yeah.
and you can finish
Yeah.
it very quickly. And it makes a nice beer. I mean, you're making a Berliner Weiss or something, something like that. You get a beer out in just a couple of weeks, and it's great. But again, to produce some of the more sophisticated stuff with using traditional techniques, it does take months. So.
Well, one of maybe a last question before we let you go for your lunch there, Brad, is
I'm fine.
one of the most exciting things in the last few months to year that I've seen is the emergence of use of fake yeast. Have you had much experience with that? The Norwegian?
There is, particularly homebrewers, there's a huge interest in using that yeast, and a lot of homebrewers like it. I mean, I was talking to a club in Arizona the other day, and they love it because a lot of them they were centered in Phoenix, and it gets up over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which I can't do the quick conversion to. It's quite warm.
Yeah, that's about
in the
38,
desert. It's quite warm.
Degrees, 39. Yeah,
quite warm in the summer, and so they really like the idea that they can make a beer at fairly high temperature and not have all these esters and off flavors produced, which is why this Norwegian yeast has become very popular, and it ferments very fast, and you can ferment at high temperature. You don't get all the off flavors. There's a lot of nice things about it. So that one's become very popular. And the other yeast people started playing with is there's some new yeast strains that I know I was talking with Chris White a while back. There's some new yeast strains that actually combine fermentation. It's actually a yeast that produces sour lactic acid as well. So there's some new yeast strains they've been playing with that produce sour flavors as well as ferment the beer out all at once. And that has some attractive,
Lotterman of that strain, but I don't think we can get it here. You can't get it in Europe. Something to do with the GMO.
Yeah, I know White Labs is working on one as well.
Great.
And a lot of the fundamental research was being done. Charlie Bamforth mentioned the other day out of the University of California, Davis. There's a team there that was working on it. So.
Awesome. Well,
what a fantastic evening.
Thank you so much for joining us, Brad. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. I apologize for running over a little bit on the speech, but
not at all.
I enjoy speaking
every
to
minute
you.
Thank you very, very much. And we're just going to have to work on a way of getting you out here. Hopefully we regroup when this whole nasty virus goes away, and we have our Fools and Fans Festival again, and it'd be lovely to get you out here somewhere.
That'd be great. And if you want me to come back sometime, just let me know. I've got, I do, this is a compressed version. I've got like 8 hours of material I do for
Let's do that on Sunday
and stuff. So I got a lot of stuff I can talk about.
Thank you very,
amazing.
very
Yeah,
much for your generosity.
Thanks a lot.
Very typical of the beer community. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, guys. That was brilliant. Thanks all for joining us. And thanks to Brad for that really informative presentation. Tune in on Friday. We got some of South Africa's homebrewing legends joining us, and we'll chat about all things homebrewing and answer any questions that you might have. Remember to check out the links of the brewery's soup kitchens in the comments below. Give them something if you can, and if you can't, then share on social media. Thanks for joining us. See you again on Friday. Cheers.